Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. I have been debating for a while now whether or not to share my updated 2025 reading list, all the books that I've read from January to June so far this year, or whether to just highlight some of the books that were most impactful, that I most enjoyed reading, because I want to be careful when it comes to sharing reading lists. I want to avoid sort of this checklist mentality that, you just read a book and you check it off, you add it to your list. And that sort of gives the impression that numbers are all that matter, that it's about quantity over quality, that the more books you read, the better a reader you are, the better a person you are, that sort of thing. I want to avoid all of that mentality because quality is definitely more important than quantity. It's not about how many books you read, it's about how well you read them. Reading a few books well in a literary way is a greater achievement than reading many books poorly. And I will say that of the 60 some odd books that I've read this year, some of them I gave a deeper, more thorough, and more literary read than others. I didn't give all of them the best read, and I will need to return to all of them. I'll need to reread all of them to fully do justice to those books. So I just want to put that out there before I begin, that I'm not a perfect reader. Just because I have this long list of books doesn't mean that I extracted every nugget of wisdom and beauty from them on my first read or my read that I gave it this year. That is definitely not true. Part of the reason that I was able to read so many books this year is because that's my job. I teach literature, and so when I go to work, I am reading books with students. It's fantastic. Reading is part of my professional life, and it's part of my personal life, and so I'm constantly reading. My whole day is reading, which is amazing. But that's a privilege that not everyone has. And so don't compare the number of books that I've read to the number of books that you've read if this is not the case for you, because it's not comparing apples to apples at all. And reading is really not a competition. As I said, it doesn't matter how many books you read, it's about how you read them. And so your and my focus should just be the book in front of us. Am I reading it well? Not how soon can I add this to my checklist of books that I've read this year. Okay. That's my little opening spiel, just to put that out there, that I hope you do not walk away from this video feeling like you aren't reading enough. That is not why I'm putting this video out. I'm putting this video out so that you can take inspiration, that you can get recommendations for books that you might be interested in reading, and I hope that I can offer you some great suggestions based on what I have read this year. Given that, I have decided to share my entire reading list, but the way I'm going to do this in this video is a little bit different than I have in the past. What I want to do first is highlight 3 fiction books that I've read most recently and go a bit more in depth with them because I just thoroughly love them and enjoy them and want to recommend them to you and give a little bit of sort of background on what this book is about. And I haven't talked about these on my channel yet, whereas many of the books that I've read throughout this year I have talked about on my channel, and I don't want to just be repeating myself. So I'm going to go a little bit more in depth on these 3 books: Lilith by George MacDonald, Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, and Summer by Edith Wharton. That's going to be the first part of this video. Second part, I'm going to go in backwards order, just sort of listing the titles and authors of all the rest of the books that I've read this year, fiction, nonfiction, without going into any real depth, just as a way of suggesting them to you, recommending them to you, because I don't think there was a single book this year that I wouldn't recommend to serious readers of classics and nonfiction, people looking to elevate their literary life. The third part of this video, I'm going to list the books that I read partly. There were a number of books where I read chunks, chapters, sections, excerpts, and so I didn't want to just add these books to my list to pretend that I read them cover to cover, because that just wasn't the case this year. But based on what I did read, I felt like I wanted to include them in this list to some degree and highlight them for you. And the fourth section of this book is going to be the books I'm currently reading. I have like nearly 10 books on the go right now, which is maybe not so great. I'm really distractible, where I'll be in the middle of one book and then something else will come across my desk or grab my attention and I'll start that book and then I'll be reading them at the same time, except that I tend to do this in larger quantities of 5 to 10 books. So yeah, my plan is to get them all done at some point. So I'm going to put these 4 sections in the description of this video so that you can easily access them if you're only interested in a part of this video. All right. That being said, I would like to get into Lilith by George MacDonald, which is the very last fiction book that I read cover to cover, and one that I must reread because there is just so much to it. And I found with George MacDonald books, you need to return to them time and time again to even really understand what's going on and what he's trying to do with the book. That was definitely the case for Lilith. So Lilith was published in 1895. It is sort of this fantasy romance. It's one of MacDonald's darkest and most profound works. Explores the nature of life, death, and salvation. It's just chock full of gorgeous prose and imagery and symbolism, as his fairy stories always are. We have this library haunted by its old librarian. We have a parallel universe in which the dead sleep until the end of the world. This is called the good death, in which life is found. We have fascinating characters like Lilith, the evil princess, the first wife of Adam. She's very complex and wicked, and yet we see a transformation in her at the end. This book is sort of an allegory of heterodox Christianity, and so some of the ideas that MacDonald is toying with in terms of life, death, and salvation, restoration, are not orthodox. MacDonald was a Christian Universalist later in life, so he believed that all souls will eventually be saved, and that evil souls will sort of be healed and restored to goodness and rightness with God rather than being punished for eternity in hell, which is generally the Orthodox position on what happens to the wicked when they die. And so, as an Orthodox Christian, I had to kind of wrestle with some of these ideas, and I can't say that I fully understand what MacDonald is saying or getting at here, but there definitely was a flavor of very interesting ideas, but ideas that I'm not sure can be translated to real life, to reality, which is fine. In a story, in a fairy tale, there doesn't need to be that perfect connection, transition. Yeah, anyways, I'm just rambling at this point because this book is very theologically and ontologically rich. And so yeah, it's one that I'm going to have to sit with and wrestle with for a while and then return to and reread time and time again. And if you're interested in fairy stories, in sort of allegories of life and death and eternity and these things, I highly recommend this book. Cannot recommend it enough. Again, it was just so beautifully written. I was just stunned at so many points throughout this book at how beautiful the prose was. Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, published in 1861. This is a Bildungsroman. I'm probably saying that wrong. Bildungsroman. So sort of a coming-of-age story about the growth and the education and the changing fortunes of young Pip, who is this poor orphan who's raised by his sort of cruel sister and his kind brother-in-law, Joe. This book is chock full of very vivid, unforgettable characters. The convict, Abel Magwitch, lonely old Miss Havisham, beautiful but cruel Estella, unsophisticated but good and kind Joe Gardry. I just found the characters more than the plot sort of key to unlocking what this book is about. Dickens asked the question, who really is the sophisticated person? This book is full of contrasts that are very familiar, that are very common in others of Dickens' works. Contrast between wealth and poverty, the city and the countryside, pride and humility. But ultimately, I think this book is about the journey of the soul towards humility, acceptance, sacrifice, service, faith, and true love. We see souls that are rich, even though they live in poverty, and we see souls that are poor, even though they live in riches. And we see Pip reaching for wealth, for fortune, for title, for the riches of this world, and sort of realizing that they aren't enriching his soul, and that actually what he might need to have an enriched soul, and therefore an enriched life, is to sacrifice these worldly things that he thinks will make him happy and will make his life rich. Okay, and then the third novel I want to highlight is Summer by Edith Wharton, published in 1917. This is a shorter coming-of-age novel. It's set in rural New England in America. It's about Charity Royale, a 17-year-old orphan who has no real prospects in life. She falls in love with a visiting architectural student named Lucius Harney. This is a novel about sort of the transition from ignorance to knowledge of the real ways of the world, not the ideal ways of the world, not the dreams that Charity has, but the reality of things. This book chronicles Charity's growth from sort of this naive young girl into an adult woman who is capable of making hard decisions and taking responsibility for her actions. And she ends up in a place where she has to make a decision, and none of the options are good. They're all difficult, less than ideal, but they're what's on offer. And so she has to make a difficult decision and go with it and face the consequences for some of her actions and some of the things that have happened to her. This novel is beautiful, but also difficult in terms of some of the themes and some of the things that Charity has to live through. Again, there's these contrasts between town life, the library, law, the moral norms, and the civil duties of the townspeople versus sort of life in the mountains, in the mountains, a life of anarchy, what looks like barbarism to the town people. You have these people living outside society and civil norms up in the mountain, and then right below them is the town, and Charity is kind of caught between them. Sort of the question that I was left with after reading this book is, what does the library represent? Because Charity works there, but not out of a genuine love of like literature and learning. She works there because it represents a way out of her home, but she's not really interested in the books themselves. She isn't a scholar, but she idolizes the scholar, Lucius Harney. She's interested in them as sort of a means to an end, as an escape from reality, not in them as art or knowledge necessarily for themselves. And so, yeah, sort of the symbolism of that library is what I'm left to wrestle with. I believe Summer is one of Edith Wharton's less well-known, less popular works, especially in the time that it was published, because it does deal with, themes of sexual awakening, of abortion, of abandonment. Yeah, there's definitely some pretty mature and difficult themes in this book, but I highly recommend it. I found it was one that, I have sort of my own ideals and convictions about things, and this book really made me see things from a different perspective sometimes and sort of wrestle with some of these ideas. So it was great, and it's a short read, it's compelling, it sucks you in, so I highly recommend Summer by Edith Wharton. Okay, those are just the 3 that I wanted to highlight. I'm going to move on now to just working through my book list backwards, meaning I'm starting with the books that I read more recently and then making my way back to the beginning of the year. After Great Expectations, Summer, and Lilith, I read An Experiment in Criticism by C.S. Lewis, and I made a whole video on that 2 videos back if you're interested in watching that and learning about Lewis's take on the literary reader versus the unliterary reader, how to really read a book well. I found that very, very helpful to sort of orient myself in what I'm doing as I'm reading books. Why am I doing it? What am I doing? Am I doing it in the best way that I possibly can? Henry V by Shakespeare, excellent history play. Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens and Peter and Wendy. These were both sort of smushed together in an Oxford classic, the 2 classic renditions of Story of Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie, which is my favorite children's story, my favorite fairy tale, honestly just my favorite story of all time. Whether a Christian Woman Should Be Educated and Other Writings by Anna Maria van Schurman. I read this as part of my master's research because I'm really interested in this figure of Anna Maria van Schurman, this savant, this woman scholar in the Dutch Republic. The Adventures of Pinocchio by Carlo Collodi. Lovely. The History of the Ancient World by Susan Wise Bauer. This was a big, thick history textbook that I used to prepare my history lectures over the past year, and I finished it this year in 2025, so I just put it on this list. The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton. Very interesting. Again, one I'll need to reread to fully understand what was actually going on. The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I did make a full video on this book because it blew me away, so you can find that on my channel. The Jewish War by Josephus. The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien, The Metamorphosis by Ovid, The Story of the World Volume 2, The Middle Ages by Susan Wise Bauer, as sort of a lower level history textbook that I used in my grade 8 medieval history class. It wasn't great. I think they needed a more advanced textbook, so we're working on that for next year. Rip Van Winkle and Other Stories by Washington Irving, The Inklings by Humphrey Carpenter, The Inferno by Dante, The Aeneid by Virgil. These medieval and classical era classics are ones that need to be reread and reread and reread and reread over and over through life, so I will definitely be rereading Inferno and the Aeneid. Heroes, The Greek Myths Reimagined by Stephen Fry. Heidi by Johanna Spyri. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, and someone told me how to properly pronounce it in a previous video, and I've done my best, just sort of remembering what that person said. The Laundryman's Boy by Edward C. Lee. Probably the only contemporary fiction, written in the last 10 years book on my list. It was great. It's fantastic, by a local Toronto author, set in a local town in St. Catharines, Ontario, and just sort of exploring the quite dismal experiences actually of a Chinese boy who came to work at a laundromat in the early 20th century. A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Lovely, beautiful. The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. Astounding. Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis. I adored this novel and highly recommend it. Phantastes by George MacDonald. Same. I loved Phantastes. It's on that same level as Lilith for me. And again, these are just complex stories that need to be reread and redigested constantly. The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. I never actually loved The Pilgrim's Progress as much as I think I should. I think it's just the allegory is a bit too much or too obvious. I don't know. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. The Second Philippic Against Antony by Cicero. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight by an unknown author. Very interesting medieval chivalric poem. The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. Also talked about this one at length in a previous video. Louisa May Alcott, The Woman Behind Little Women by Harriet Reason. A great biography of Louisa May Alcott. Mythos by Stephen Fry, again, the original Greek myth retold. Macbeth by William Shakespeare. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. Blew my mind. I adore this novel, and I did talk about it at length in a previous video as well. A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. A Portrait of the Malefactress as a Young Woman. This was my own novel that I reread about a year after self-publishing it, just to see how it made me feel. And yeah, it was good. If you're interested in reading my novel, the link will be in the description. Antony and Cleopatra by William Shakespeare. The History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth. Sort of this quasi-mythical history. Yeah, there's a lot of problems with it as a historical record. Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. The Secret History by Donna Tartt. Knowing God by J.I. Packer. Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. I actually thoroughly enjoyed this book. It's one of my favorite Austen novels. Paradise Lost by John Milton. This one was a very challenging read, but also very rewarding and fruitful, and again, one that I will need to reread. Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. Winning His Spurs by G.A. Henty. I'm not sure how I feel about G.A. Henty books, sort of these original historical fiction novels. They're too plot heavy. It's like 100 things happen per chapter. It's just constantly go, go, go. It's not very introspective or character oriented, which is something that I love in fiction. My students, especially my male students, really enjoyed sort of the action-packed adventure fast-pacedness of the G.A. Henty novels that we read this year. For myself as an adult teacher, I was sort of just like, this isn't great literature necessarily. They are quite historically accurate, and we are learning a lot about the medieval world at different times in different parts of the medieval world, but it's not great literature at an artistic level for sure. The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. Also blew my mind. I loved this book. Leonardo da Vinci, a biography by Walter Isaacson. Fantastic. Made a full video on that one as well. The Song of Roland. Another medieval poem by an unknown author. Mistress Pat by Ellen Montgomery. The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom. The Poetics by Aristotle. The Blue Castle by Ellen Montgomery. Once There Was a Bear. Tales of Before It All Began by Jane Riordan. Sort of a collection about Pooh Bear and his friends and sort of their origins in Christopher Robin's life. Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. The Republic by Plato. Remaking the World. How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West by Andrew L. Wilson. That was a great history book. I loved it. Rembrandt is in the Wind. Learning to Live Art Through the Eyes of Faith by Russ Ramsey. Fantastic. Highly recommend it, and I'm hoping to get my hands on Russ Ramsey's more recent publication, Van Gogh Has a Broken Heart, which is also about art and faith. Little Men by Louisa May Alcott. Really great as a classical educator to sort of watch how Jo handles her group of boys and how she sort of gives them this holistic education. She's teaching them academically, right? They're learning subjects, they're learning to read and write, but her key focus is ultimately their character and shaping them to be virtuous, good young men. It's really, really fantastic as an educator to read Little Men. Emily's Quest and Emily Climbs by Ellen Montgomery. Definitely started the year on a Montgomery kick, and I read probably 10 of her novels last year. I just adore her. She's my favorite Canadian author and one of my favorite authors of all times, I would say. I love the Anne series, I loved the Emily series, and sort of some of her other one-off novels. One thing I do like about my reading this year is that it's very diverse, right? I'm reading Greek and Roman classics, biographies, I'm reading medieval literature, I'm reading, 18th, 19th century novels, even some 20th century novels. Yeah, there's a lot going on here, and I thoroughly enjoyed my reading life this year. Some partly read books or some books that I read excerpts from. The War with Hannibal by Livy. Augustus Caesar's World by Genevieve Foster. This is a really great history book to orient students in, the world of Augustus Caesar, sort of at the turn of the BC AD, turn of the millennium there. It's great for students, great for teenagers. It's very accessible and digestible. The Annals of Imperial Rome by Tacitus or Tacitus. Jewish Antiquities by Josephus. Loved Josephus. Read a bunch of Josephus, The Jewish War and Jewish Antiquities, and thoroughly enjoyed it. I feel like I learned so much that sort of supplemented my readings of the Old Testament and my understanding of the history of ancient Israel. Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And then some books that I have on the go still, and will probably be reading for months to come. The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser. This is definitely going to be one that I work through very slowly. The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. Honestly, I kind of lost interest in this one. I don't know why. It just didn't have that same pull, that same sort of brilliance and beauty that Summer by Edith Wharton did. Yeah, it feels a bit sort of nihilistic, hedonistic, and I really struggle with books in which characters are sort of living that kind of lifestyle and living out that sort of worldview. The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis by Jason Baxter. Great book, huge insight into Lewis the medievalist and sort of what he was trying to rescue from the medieval tradition, from the medieval world for modern readers. This book is quite heady and academic, and so it's one that I'm working through slowly and taking careful notes with. Same with The Library, A Fragile History by Andrew Pettigrew and Arthur de Ludowen. Very thick book on the history of the library and so interesting, but one that's just going to take me a while. Tending the Heart of Virtue, the book about fairy stories, fairy tales and the moral imagination by Vigen Guroian. Absolutely love it, but because it's quite topical, I feel like I need to read the fairy stories that he's specifically focusing on first before reading his chapter on that fairy tale. So I did so for Pinocchio. After I read Pinocchio by Carlo Collodi, I read Vigen Guroian's take on the Pinocchio fairy tale, but now I need to read some of the other fairy tales before I can let Vigen Guroian speak to them. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. This is what my husband and I are reading aloud right now as we drive. It's pretty good. It's a bit dry at times. I feel like that's not a good criticism. It's not, because this is good literature, but I'm just having a hard time being sort of excited about it, as opposed to Les Mis, which I'm also reading and is sort of similar in theme and time period, dealing with the Age of Revolution, dealing with sort of the contrast between the lower classes, the impoverished people, and the state or the king. Very similar themes in these two books, and Les Mis is much thicker and longer work, but I am like eating it up. It's so good. Victor Hugo is a genius, and I'm loving Les Mis, whereas I'm liking A Tale of Two Cities. Let me know if I'm missing something here, if you have any thoughts on this contrast. I'm also still working through Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. I've been trying to get into Elizabeth Gaskell and read her novels this year. I feel like there's something there that's missing for me. I'm having a hard time focusing on this book and enjoying it. I think I'm missing something. I think I need to do it justice and give it a more dedicated and a better read than I have been so far, but that's just where I'm at with Cranford. Okay, those are all the books that I have on the go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Only 8, not even 10. Okay, good. Oh, except that I'm also reading How to Read a Book, The Classical Guide to Intellectual Reading by Mortimer Adler and Charles Van Doren. This is helping me sort of think about how to read different kinds of books, and I'm preparing lectures to teach next year. How to read imaginative literature versus how to read a historical text. These are different sort of skills that I think students need to know the difference between these different types of literature and how their different approaches, different ways of reading are applicable to them. And then if you're watching this video, I'm in Europe. I'm traveling around the UK, Scotland, and England, and I'm very likely reading the 3 books that I chose to take on this trip with me, which are The Complete Fairy Tales of George MacDonald, The Narnian by Alan Jacobs, and Gaudy Night by Dorothy Sayers. So that is all I would like to say for this video. Yeah, it's been a great reading year. I've loved reading diverse works, some classics that are easier to read, like Ella Montgomery novels, and then some classics that are very challenging. It's been good to have such a diverse palette and to be reading so many different things from so many different time periods and different genres and all that. Let me know if you've read any of these books and if you have any thoughts or hot takes that you want to share. Let me know in the comments below. Let me know what you've been reading this year. I love getting book recommendations from you guys, so please drop those in the comments below so that the second half of my year can be just as full of great books as the first. Thank you so much for being here. Please leave this video a like, subscribe to my channel, comment down below, and I will see you in a few weeks when the dust settles and I'm back from Europe and I'm back making videos. So, bye-bye!